Hello everybody, it's good to see you all again. I'm not quite sure what's happened to our weather, but of course in many ways this is what I expect for a typical English summer, going around in my shorts and my sweatshirt in the drizzly rain. So I guess in many ways we're back to some kind of normal, even in the abnormal lockdown and the restrictions. But I certainly hope that you're doing okay today. So if you've already looked up the set gospel reading for Sunday the 16th of August, you will realise that it is in two sections, two stories that could legitimately be taken separately, and indeed in the past I have done just that, separated out these two readings and preached on them on two separate Sundays. For there is of course no written rule that you must stick to the set readings or read them in their entirety. But it is true that one reading is interconnected with the other. For what Jesus says in the first helps us to look at the second with keener attention and a deeper understanding. Therefore, I am going to look at this reading set for this Sunday in two halves, but with a couple of additional verses thrown in to help us with the context. So firstly, I'd like you to turn to your Bible, if you have it there with you, to Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 to 2. In my New Living Translation, these verses say this. So reading from Matthew 15, the first two verses. Some Pharisees and teachers of religious law now arrived from Jerusalem to interview Jesus. Why do your disciples disobey our age-old traditions? They demanded. They ignore our tradition of ceremonial hand-washing before they eat. So I've read those so that we can really grasp what's going on here. And we soon realise by reading those two verses that the religious experts, the Pharisees and the teachers of religious law have travelled. They've travelled up from Jerusalem to Galilee, some 70 miles north, in order to challenge Jesus. And the subject of their challenge is hand washing. Ritual or ceremonial hand washing would have originated as good practice for a healthy body. After all, I think we all agree that it makes sense to wash our hands before eating, don't we? And never has hand washing been more important than it is now as we try to avoid contracting the coronavirus. However, in biblical times, hand washing became a religious ritual that gradually became more and more complicated, with the focus shifting from hygiene to an outward show of being religiously clean. And if you claimed to be a truly religious Jew, then you were required to abide by the strict hand-washing rules. Very often, in a Jewish home, water jars were kept ready to be used before a meal. The minimum amount of water to be used was a quarter of a log. This was enough to fill 10 eggshells. The water was first poured on both hands, with the fingers pointed upwards, with the water required to run up the arm as far as the wrist, and it had to drop off at the wrist, for the water was now itself, of course, unclean, having touched the unclean hands. So we can see that the water has to run down and then drip off the wrists. That was the first way that they were to do this ceremonial hand washing. And then that process was repeated And it was repeated with the hands held in the opposite direction with the fingers pointing down. And so both hands pointing down, and the water poured and it run off the fingers. Couldn't have it go back the other way. And the process was finally done. Finally, the hands were clean when each hand was rubbed with the fist of the other. So once the water had been poured 2 ways, you had to rub each hand with the fist of the other, and then they were clean, ceremonially clean. And then this was repeated between every course of the meal. So imagine it. Between every course, you had to go through the same process. Water pouring, dripping off, other way, pouring, dripping off, fist of each hand between courses. And if you didn't do it, then any food that was touched by your hands that hadn't been done with this ceremonial hand washing, and then if you touched it and you ate it, that food would be considered unclean and then you would be defiled. So we can see it's quite an elaborate process that originated from something that was purely about hygiene. Jesus and his 12 disciples, they were out on the road, weren't they? They were travelling, they were healing the sick, feeding the poor, teaching on the hillside, all those things that were part of Jesus' ministry. They would have washed their hands before eating, but they would not have had time or indeed the facilities to abide by this elaborate process that was required for this ritual ceremonial hand washing. And so in the minds of the experts, Jesus and his followers were breaking the rules, and that made them bad, and it made them ungodly, and it made them subject to this accusation. Now, in many ways, I do sympathise with the religious rulers. They have devoted their lives to upholding the Jewish law, to uphold it and all its associated rituals and practices. And in their eyes, therefore, Jesus, and by association his disciples, they not only challenge some of these, but they also ignore some and break others. Now, as a superintendent minister with pastoral oversight of a circuit of churches, this is the rule book, CPD, that I am charged by the Methodist Church to uphold. It is my job to ensure that not only I and my colleagues, but also all members of the circuit churches abide by the rules in this book. That can at times be challenging. However, the reality is that that book is only part, of course, of what it means to be a church. Inevitably, individual churches develop their own customs and their own traditions, their own ways of doing things, and so on, which over time, almost undetected, can become the accepted norm. All institutions do this. They all do it. They all have their own little ways of doing things that if you don't follow, you get called up on. I still shake my head in disbelief when during my RAF training, we were ordered, yes, ordered, to polish the underside of our combat boots. Nowhere, of course, is it written down, and no one, after they've completed their training, ever does such a thing again. Why would you? Black polish on the underside of a combat boot means that as soon as you walk on any type of flooring, it leaves black marks. Yes, of course, get the mud and the grass off those boots after a hard day's slog out on patrol before entering the building or indeed walking into your bedroom. That makes complete sense to me. But loading the underside of the boot with black boot polish just so that they look nice for inspection, in my opinion, madness. Absolute madness. But of course, if we didn't do it and we got picked up, we were punished. If enough people comply, something quickly becomes a recognised rule, doesn't it? No matter how ridiculous it is, no matter how inappropriate or difficult to uphold. Jesus didn't want people to follow rules and rituals just for the sake of the rule or the ritual. He wanted people to love God and to love each other. He never actually broke any of the Old Testament law, but he did strip away many of the superfluous layers that had been added by generations of religious leaders. So now that we kind of grasp all of that, now let's find out how Jesus responded to their accusation. So now we're going to read the first part of the set reading for today. We're going to read Matthew chapter 15, verses 10 to 20. So I invite you to join me. Matthew 15, beginning at verse 10. Then Jesus called to the crowds and said, "Listen to what I say and try to understand. You are not defiled by what you eat. You are defiled by what you say and do." Then the disciples came to him and asked, "Do you realize you offended the Pharisees by what you just said?" Jesus replied, "Every plant not planted by my heavenly Father will be rooted up, so ignore them. They are blind guides leading the blind. And if one blind person guides another, they will both fall into a ditch." And Peter asked Jesus, "Explain what you meant when you said people aren't defiled by what they eat." "Don't you understand?" Jesus asked him. "Anything you eat passes through the stomach, then goes out of the body. But evil words come from an evil heart and defile the person who says them. For from the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, all other sexual immorality, theft, lying and slander. These are what defile you. Eating with unwashed hands could never defile you and make you unacceptable to God." So Jesus' words, those words to the crowds, are pretty clear, aren't they? It's not what goes in, but it's what comes out that counts. No one is going to defile themselves by eating food that is touched by hands that have not gone through ritual, ceremonial hand cleansing. No one is going to cut themselves off from God by what they eat or how they eat it. Being a healthy Christian is much bigger than that. Being a healthy Christian is about what is in our hearts and our minds, the words that we say, the actions that we do, the thoughts that we have. Sometimes, just sometimes, we can get so bogged down in the rules and the rituals that we have created that we miss the point. We miss the point of who we follow and what we are trying to achieve. For the words that we say, the actions that we do, and the thoughts that we have are important. That's why the next story, the second half of this set reading for today, is so revealing and so very important. So join me again as we now turn back to our Bibles, to the final part of today's Gospel, and we continue in Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 to 28. Jesus then left Galilee and went north to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman who lived there came to him pleading, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David, for my daughter has a demon in her, and it is severely tormenting her." But Jesus gave her no reply, not even a word. Then his disciples urged him to send her away. "Tell her to leave," they said. "She is bothering us all with her begging." Then he said to the woman, "I was sent only to help the people of Israel, God's lost sheep, not the Gentiles." But she came and worshipped him and pleaded again, "Lord, help me." "It isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs," he said. "Yes, Lord," she replied, "but even dogs are permitted to eat crumbs that fall beneath their master's table." "Woman," Jesus said to her, "your faith is great. Your request is granted." And her daughter was instantly healed. On the face of it, the last person that the Canaanite woman should go to is Jesus the Jew. As a Canaanite, the woman is descended from the original people of the land of Canaan, who were dispossessed by the Israelites. Jews held a deeply grim view of Canaanites, and they were considered as the most ritually impure people. We're back to being ritually unclean here, aren't we? See how the readings are linked? Although this event takes place in Tyre, on the coast north of Galilee, which is Gentile territory, as a Canaanite woman approaching a group of Jewish men, particularly shouting and drawing attention to herself in the way that she does, we are left in no doubt as to her desperation. This is massively risky for her and totally scandalous for Jesus to have anything to do with her. We cannot begin even really to imagine the woman's suffering and that of her daughter, or the lengths that she would have gone to before swallowing all of her pride and potentially risking her life to approach Jesus and his group of disciples. What she shouts is highly significant. I'm just going to reread verse 22. "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David." Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. She is acknowledging Jesus' background and his heritage. She's hugely respectful, with no hint of hatred or malice. She knows who he is. She knows of his ministry. She believes that he can help her. The disciples understandably want to get rid of her as quickly as possible. They want to get rid of her because she is an unclean woman, causing a scene. And because Jesus does not initially respond to her, the disciples must have thought that Jesus wanted her gone too. Jesus' his reluctance to help, and the use of his words certainly make us feel extremely uncomfortable, don't they? Initially, he simply ignores the woman. And then when the disciples urge him to send her away, he basically says that his mission is towards the Jews, and he does not see himself as having any duty towards non-Jews. But we see in verse 25 that she is not so easily persuaded. Verse 25, but she came and worshipped him and pleaded again, Lord, help me. His response this second time is even more offensive and insulting, for he basically calls the woman a dog. But her response is so humbling, and it is so daring, for she does not deny the rights of the people of Israel, but she says that God's elect, the Jews, are given bread. But even we, she says, even us, the unclean Gentiles, the dogs, will get some crumbs. Her faith is awe-inspiring, and it appears to have an impact on Jesus, for he heals her daughter. It is almost as if he has had his mind changed by this woman. Now, this Jesus here in this encounter probably does not sit too well with us, I suspect. Why was he so rude? Why did he not respond to her plight right away? They're troubling questions, aren't they? Some scholars suggest that Jesus was merely testing the woman. Others simply imply that he was highlighting for the disciples their inherited understanding, and then he contradicted their understanding. And whilst both these explanations are possibilities, the obvious answer is that Jesus genuinely did not see himself as having any duty towards non-Jews, and that his ministry was primarily concentrated on the people of Israel. Perhaps this encounter with this Canaanite woman was a learning experience for Jesus himself, and it did in fact alter his attitude towards the Gentiles. Who knows? The truth is, we will never know, of course, the real reason why Jesus acted in the way that he did towards this woman. It was true, though, at this stage in his ministry, his work was directed toward the Jews. And whether he said what he said with a twinkle in his eye, knowing the courage and knowing the faith of the woman before him, or whether he deliberately wanted to see how the disciples would react, or whether he actually meant what he said, all of that is up for debate. But there are some things that we can take away from this passage. I think the first thing we can take away is the woman was not welcome and she did not fit in. Now, this is true for some people today who do not feel welcome in our churches or in our church communities because, for whatever reason, they do not fit the idea of what is acceptable. Every church member declares that all are welcome, but it is worth thinking about how that welcome is communicated and experienced. Secondly, in this story, Jesus did widen his mission to include those who were not considered part of it. And that shows us that God's loving acceptance is for all. And I wonder what implications then this may have for our own church outreach. That God's loving acceptance is for all. And thirdly and finally, the woman was hugely respectful towards Jesus. Is not this a very good model for our own dialogue with people of other faiths and none? It's worth noting that Jesus did not convert or even attempt to convert the woman. He merely acknowledged that her faith was great. So being a healthy Christian, it would seem, is not about how we do things, what rituals and ceremonies we have developed, pouring scorn on those who do not adhere to them. But it is more about what is in our hearts and what is in our minds. The words that we say and the actions that we do and the thoughts that we have. The love we show to others. Certainly, this two-part reading has given us much to think about, hasn't it? You may have preferred me to have separated it out on two separate occasions after all, but they are linked. They are linked. Let's not get bogged down by things that have become tradition, the way we've always done something, and use that to blind us to the fact that we do need to be loving and accepting of all. So thank you for joining with me and staying with me through that. And I wish you well for the week ahead. And may God indeed be right there with you, whatever's happening and wherever it may take you. Stay safe. God bless.